Story number 1. The Whispering Rain. The storm hit Willow Creek like a beast set loose from the darkest corners of the earth. That night, the wind howled through the trees like a wild animal, bending them so far that their limbs creaked under the pressure. The rain came down in sheets, smothering the town, turning the dirt roads into rivers of mud. It was the kind of night that made people want to lock their doors, shut their windows, and bury themselves under the covers. But on this particular night, the people of Willow Creek were not safe in their homes. Not from the storm, not from what was coming. At first, it was barely noticeable. A faint sound, almost like the rustling of leaves in a far-off field. But it wasn't the wind. No, this was something else. The rain, falling in torrents, began to whisper. At first, it was soft. Only a few heard it, and they thought it was just the storm playing tricks on their minds. But as the rain picked up, so did the whispers, each one louder, more insistent, and carrying with it a chilling sense of urgency. Come closer, it's better this way. It was a voice, but not a single voice. It sounded like many voices, all of them pleading, calling, beckoning. At first, it was a distant murmur, but then it grew, swirling around the town, creeping into every corner of every house, every shop, and every empty space. People started to hear it in their kitchens, in their bedrooms, in the quiet moments just before they drifted into sleep. It was always the same message. Take it. Take the easy way out. Old Mrs. Whitmore, who lived alone in the crooked house at the edge of town, was the first to act on the whispers. She stood by her window, watching the rain beat against the glass, feeling the wet chill seep through the walls. She heard the voice clearer than ever, and before she knew what she was doing, she was stepping out into the storm. No one saw her leave. By morning, she was gone, and Mrs. Whitmore wasn't alone. Soon, others followed. A young man named Jake, struggling with debt and a broken heart, couldn't escape the constant pull of the voices. He thought they offered him peace, the sweet release he'd been longing for. He drove his truck into the deep woods where the rain pounded harder, and he never came back. The whispers were growing louder. They were spreading through the town like wildfire, slipping into the thoughts of every man, woman, and child, turning their heads toward darker thoughts. And the storm, oh, it wouldn't stop. It raged for days, and the voices only grew more intense. But something was shifting in the town. People who had heard the whispers and resisted them began to speak to one another. They knew something wasn't right. There was an unnatural bond among them, something that drew them together in ways they couldn't understand. A group of strangers, all from different walks of life, met at the local diner, sitting in booths far apart at first, eyes darting nervously at one another. But they had all heard the whispers, all felt the compulsion. They all knew, deep down, that something had to be done. They spoke in hushed tones, piecing together bits of old town lore, the kind of stories passed down by old-timers who would never speak of them outside of the safety of the tavern. But in the last few years, those stories had started to fade, just like the town itself. Willow Creek had always been a quiet, out-of-the-way place, forgotten by most. But that was the problem. There was a curse, a long-forgotten tragedy that no one cared to remember. 50 years ago, a fire had burned down the old orphanage on the hill. It had been an accident, or so they said. But some of the townsfolk believed it wasn't. They believed that the fire had been started by a young boy, just a child, who had been driven mad by a voice in the storm. A voice that had whispered the same things they were hearing now. And in the fire's ashes, the curse had taken root. The rain, it seemed, had always come when it was time to collect. The group of strangers decided to go to the hill to find the ruins of the orphanage and put an end to the curse once and for all. The storm raged around them as they made their way up the path, their feet slipping on the slick mud. They could hear the whispers clearly now, and they could see something else in the distance. Figures moving through the trees just beyond their reach, shadows in the storm. The spirits of the lost children, the ones who never made it out of the orphanage alive, were still there, lingering in the rain. And they wanted revenge. The wind screamed around them, making it almost impossible to hear anything over the howling gusts. But then, amid the chaos of the storm, they saw it. A figure standing alone in the ruins of the orphanage. It was a boy, no older than 10, his clothes tattered and his face obscured by the rain. His eyes glowed in the dark, like two embers waiting to burn. The whispers came from him. "Join us," he said, his voice thin and cold, just above the wind. "It's easy. Just listen to the rain." The group felt the pull of it then, a deep compulsion, as if the very earth beneath their feet was trying to pull them down into the earth itself. The whispers were loud now, louder than they had ever been. They were like a drumbeat in the chest, impossible to ignore. But one of them, a woman named Clara, stepped forward. She had heard the voices too, but she had resisted. She had lost so much already. Her family, her friends. But this was different. This wasn't peace. It was a lie. With all the strength she had left, Clara spoke over the whispers, her voice trembling but clear. "You can't have us. Not today." And with those words, the whispers began to fade. The wind slowed, the rain softened, and the boy in the ruins disappeared. The curse was broken. But Willow Creek would never be the same. The storm passed, but the memory of it, the feeling of those voices, would haunt the town for years to come. And the rain, well, it still falls sometimes. And every now and then, if you listen closely enough, you might hear the whispers, just barely, beneath the sound of the storm. Story number 2. The Shadow in the Window. Emma hadn't planned on coming back. Not after all these years, not after everything that had happened. But there was something pulling her, something she couldn't quite explain. Maybe it was the sudden death of her mother, or maybe it was the guilt that had gnawed at her for years. She didn't know. All she knew was that she was standing in front of the old house again, her childhood home. The place she'd left in a hurry, never looking back. The house hadn't changed. It was just as she remembered it. The same peeling paint on the porch, the same creaky steps that made a noise when you walked up to the front door. The same smell of mildew and old wood that had always lingered inside. It felt almost like stepping back into a time that no longer existed. A time when she was still a child and the world seemed simpler. But that was years ago. She had grown up, and she thought she had left everything behind. The rain began to pour as soon as she stepped inside, the kind of storm that seemed to arrive out of nowhere, the sky darkening quickly, as if the storm had been waiting for her. It was the kind of rain that beat against the windows, the kind that made you want to stay inside, safe and warm. Emma could hear it, the steady drum of water hitting the roof, the sound of the wind howling around the house. She set down her bags, wiped the water from her face, and stood still for a moment, listening to the house. It was so quiet, too quiet, and the silence reminded her of when she was a child, hiding in her room, wishing the world outside would go away. But there was no escaping it now. The house had its own kind of stillness, a calm that seemed to swallow up everything, even the sound of the storm outside. Emma slowly made her way through the house, her footsteps soft against the wooden floors. She passed the kitchen, the old dining room, and then came to the stairs. She had to go upstairs, to her old bedroom. She didn't know why, but something inside her urged her to go up there, as if there was something waiting for her. When she reached the top of the stairs, she felt it. The cold air. It was always colder in the hallway up here, colder than anywhere else in the house. She paused for a moment, looking down the dark corridor, and that's when she saw it. The window. Her old bedroom had a big window, the kind you could look out of and see the world beyond. And it was there, in that window, that she saw something that made her freeze. A shadow. At first, she thought it was just the way the rain was hitting the glass, casting strange shapes in the reflection. But then, as her eyes focused, she realized it wasn't just a reflection. There was a shape standing there, just beyond the glass. A figure. She had seen that shadow before. It was the same shadow that had haunted her as a child. The one she had convinced herself was just her imagination. It had always been there when the rain came, always lurking just out of sight, watching her. She had told herself it was just a trick of the light, just a figment of her imagination. But now, standing here, it was real. The figure in the window didn't move at first. It just stood there, as if waiting for something. Emma's heart began to race, and her breath came faster, but she couldn't look away. The figure didn't seem to notice her at all, just standing in that window, dark and still. Then the storm grew louder. The wind howled and the rain beat harder against the house, and that's when it happened. The figure in the window started to move. Slowly, deliberately, it shifted, as if it had come to life. Emma's breath caught in her throat as the figure seemed to inch closer to the glass. She could see it now. Its features, though faint, were becoming clearer. It was tall, its shape long and thin, its face hidden in shadow. But its eyes, those eyes, they were staring right at her. The shadow didn't stop moving. It came closer, inch by inch, until it was almost pressed against the glass. Emma could see its hands now, long and bony, its fingers curling against the window pane. She wanted to scream, but her voice was caught in her throat. Her body was frozen, unable to move. She knew she should run, but her feet wouldn't obey her. The figure was getting closer, pressing its face against the glass, its mouth opening in a silent scream, as if it was trying to get to her. And then it stopped. The rain poured harder, the wind screeched louder, but the figure just hung there, its eyes never leaving hers. It was as if it was waiting for something she couldn't understand. Suddenly, the silence shattered. A knock at the door, a sharp, hard knock, like someone was trying to break in. Emma snapped out of her trance, her heart pounding in her chest. She turned away from the window, her legs shaking as she stumbled toward the door, but she didn't dare look back. She opened the door, and there was nothing. Just the storm, just the rain pouring down, as if the world outside had swallowed up everything in sight. But the shadow in the window was still there, watching. And Emma knew, deep down, that it would never go away. It would always be there, waiting for her to look back again. Story number 3. Midnight at Briarwood Cemetery. The rain had been coming down for days, falling like a blanket, thick and relentless, turning the streets of Briarwood into rivers. But it was the cemetery, Briarwood Cemetery, that bore the worst of it. The ground was soft now, like wet sponge, and the headstones leaned awkwardly as if the earth was trying to swallow them whole. The place was a swamp of mud, the paths disappearing under the relentless downpour. No one in town would dare set foot in that graveyard, not during a storm like this. But then, there was Jason. Jason Cartwright had grown up in Briarwood, a small town where everybody knew your name, your family, and every mistake you ever made. He was 16, the kind of kid who thought he was too cool for rules, too tough to fear anything. He'd heard the stories, of course, the ones about the curse, the restless spirits, and the strange things that happened in Briarwood Cemetery when the rain wouldn't stop. The stories never seemed real to him, just stuff the old folks whispered to scare the younger kids. But tonight, Jason felt different. Maybe it was the storm, the way it made the whole town feel like it was holding its breath. Or maybe it was the dare. "Bet you won't go spend the night in Briarwood Cemetery," Benny had said, his voice full of that smugness only a kid who thought he knew everything could pull off. It had been one of those stupid challenges, the kind that were supposed to prove something. Jason hadn't hesitated. Of course, he'd go. Of course, he'd show Benny he wasn't afraid of anything. So, just past midnight, when the rest of the town was hidden under blankets, Jason found himself at the edge of the cemetery, staring through the rusted gate, the cold rain slapping against his face like 1,000 tiny fists. He could feel it, the weight of the place. There was something wrong with Briarwood Cemetery. He'd always known it, even if he didn't believe in the stories. The way the trees bent unnaturally, the way the mist never quite left, no matter how hard the sun tried to rise. And tonight, with the storm drowning out all the other sounds, it felt heavier than usual. Jason pushed the gate open, the hinges screeching, almost in warning. He stepped inside, boots sinking into the mud with each step, the air thick with the smell of damp earth. The gravestones stood like soldiers, crooked and broken, half swallowed by the swampy ground. The only sound was the steady drum of the rain, but even that felt wrong, like it wasn't just rain, it was something else. Jason made his way deeper into the cemetery, his footsteps muffled by the mud. He didn't know why he was moving toward the center, but he felt the pull, like the ground itself was calling to him. The old oak tree stood there, the one with the twisted branches, its gnarled roots breaking through the earth, like it had something to hide. Jason had always been told to stay away from that tree, to never come close, but tonight it felt different. It felt like the place he needed to be. The rain was coming down harder now, the drops so thick they looked like sheets of silver, blurring everything around him. Jason stood under the oak, his jacket soaked, his hair clinging to his forehead. He pulled out a cigarette, trying to steady his nerves, but before he could light it, he heard it. A whisper. Soft at first, carried by the wind. "Help me." Jason froze. His heart skipped a beat, the cigarette falling from his hand. He looked around, but there was nothing. No one, just the trees, the gravestones, the rain. "Help me." The whisper came again, louder now, almost desperate. His breath caught in his throat. His mind screamed to run, but his feet were rooted to the spot. It wasn't just the rain that felt off. The air was thick with something else, something darker. He turned slowly, his eyes scanning the cemetery, but there was nothing to see. Nothing except the trees swaying in the wind, the shadowed gravestones, the empty graves. And then he saw it. In the distance, near one of the old mausoleums, a figure moved. Jason's heart slammed against his ribs as he squinted through the rain, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The figure was tall, almost impossibly tall, with long, thin arms that seemed to stretch toward him. And it was moving, slowly, dragging itself across the mud, its movements jerky, unnatural. Jason's legs finally found the strength to move, and he started backing away, his mind screaming at him to run, but his body felt frozen. The figure was getting closer, the rain falling in sheets, so heavy that it felt like he was drowning. He couldn't see its face, but the way it moved, the way it seemed to bend and stretch in unnatural angles, filled him with a terror he couldn't explain. He turned to run, but the ground beneath him seemed to shift, the mud sinking deeper with each step, as if the cemetery itself was trying to pull him under. The whispers grew louder, swirling around him, surrounding him, voices of the dead pleading, crying out. "Help me!" they cried. "Help us!" Jason stumbled, nearly falling into a grave, but he caught himself. The cemetery was alive, it was moving, it was changing. The rain wasn't just rain, it was a gateway, a portal to something darker, something that had been waiting for him. He ran, his breath ragged, his heart pounding in his chest, but no matter how fast he moved, the figure was always behind him, dragging itself closer. The whispers filled his ears, drowning out everything else, until it felt like his skull would split from the pressure. And then, just as he thought he couldn't take it anymore, he reached the gate. The rain was still pouring down, but the figure had stopped. It was standing there, just beyond the gate, watching him with empty, hollow eyes. Jason didn't stop to look back. He didn't stop until he was safely out of the cemetery, his lungs burning, his mind spinning. He couldn't explain what had happened, what he had seen, or what the rain had turned into. All he knew was that Briarwood Cemetery was no longer just a graveyard. It was a place where the dead could reach out, where the rain was a doorway to something darker, something that never left. And the curse of Briarwood Cemetery was real. Jason knew he would never go back, but somewhere, deep in his bones, he knew it wasn't over. The rain would fall again, and the dead would wait. Story number 4. The Last Ride of Harry Daniels. Harry Daniels had seen his fair share of stormy nights on the road. As a truck driver for over 30 years, the rain had become a regular companion, and the highway his endless, lonely friend. But tonight, the storm felt different. It was like the rain had a mind of its own, hammering against the windshield, wiper blades struggling to keep up. The night seemed darker, the kind of dark that swallowed everything, leaving only the sound of the truck's engine and the roar of the wind. Harry had been hauling loads from town to town for most of his life, and it never bothered him. It was just a job, nothing more, nothing less. He wasn't one for thinking too much about fate or destiny. But tonight, it felt like the road was playing tricks on him. He glanced at the clock, just past midnight. He was headed down Route 57, the long stretch of highway that ran through the woods, with barely a light in sight for miles. The rain slashed at the truck like the heavens themselves were angry. Harry's eyes darted to the rearview mirror, catching glimpses of other headlights, strange shapes moving through the haze of rain. At first, it didn't register, but as the minutes ticked on, something started to nag at him. The other vehicles, they were too close, too many of them, and they didn't seem to be in a hurry, just creeping along in the storm. Harry furrowed his brow, squinting through the rain. There was a car just behind him now. A beat-up sedan, its headlights dim but steady, moving at a pace that felt deliberate, too deliberate. Harry could have sworn he saw a familiar face through the foggy window, though the image was so distorted by the rain that he couldn't make it out. Then the car swerved slightly, as if the driver had caught the same thought. Harry turned his attention back to the road, the endless stretch of wet asphalt ahead. But when he checked the mirror again, the car was gone, vanished like smoke. "Damn storm," he muttered to himself, gripping the wheel harder. But the feeling didn't go away. The next mile felt longer than the last. The storm was growing fiercer, and Harry could feel the pressure in the air, like something was about to break. He passed a truck, an old rusty rig, its headlights too bright in the wet darkness. But it wasn't the truck that caught his eye, it was the driver. Harry's heart skipped a beat as the face of the man behind the wheel flashed in his mind. It was Tommy O'Donnell, an old friend from his younger days. A guy Harry had worked with, driven side by side with for years, until that fateful night when they'd gotten into a huge argument over a woman. Harry had thrown the first punch, and Tommy had taken it. But Tommy had been the one who lost everything: his job, his reputation, his life spiraling downhill after that fight. The guy had never forgiven Harry for what happened. And looking at that face in the driver's seat, Harry felt a chill he couldn't explain. The truck passed him slowly, but as it did, Harry couldn't shake the feeling that Tommy was still there, watching him from the shadows of the truck's cab. Then, without a warning, the truck pulled into the darkness ahead, vanishing into the storm. Harry gripped the wheel tighter. His knuckles were white now. What the hell was going on? As he sped down the road, the storm only seemed to grow worse, the thunder crashing like a warning shot. But that wasn't the worst of it. The worst part was what came next. A flash of headlights appeared on his left. He could barely make out the shape of a motorcycle, cutting through the rain like a ghost. Harry's eyes widened as the rider pulled up alongside him, the engine's growl a low, menacing rumble. There, behind the helmet's visor, was a face he recognized all too well. It was Frank Marlowe, another man from his past. Frank was the guy who had worked under Harry in the warehouse, the guy who had been there for him when things were tough, the guy Harry had left behind when he'd taken a new, better job without a second thought. Frank had been crushed. His family, his life, everything had started to fall apart after Harry's betrayal. Frank's motorcycle swerved dangerously close to Harry's truck, the engine roaring, and then it disappeared into the rain without a sound, just like the others. Harry's breath came faster now, his hands slick on the steering wheel. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think straight. Every vehicle he passed, every flash of a face in the rain, was another person from his past, another soul he had wronged. The faces of his betrayals were haunting him now, like ghosts riding along with him, waiting for him to pay the price. He pushed the pedal down harder, the engine roaring as he tried to outrun the storm, tried to outrun the past. But no matter how fast he drove, the rain kept falling. Heavier now, and the faces, the shadows, they kept coming. One by one, the vehicles passed him, all of them with faces Harry knew. Faces of men he'd cheated, lied to, abandoned. Faces that were angry, sad, twisted by regret. Faces that would never forgive him. The road stretched endlessly in front of him, but the rain was like a wall, trapping him in place. He looked out the window again, but there was nothing there. Nothing except the pouring rain, the dark highway, and the sudden bone-chilling realization that he was not alone. A shadow flickered in the corner of his eye. A figure. A man. Harry slammed on the brakes, heart pounding. The truck slid, tires screeching, but he couldn't stop. The rain was thick now, pouring down like a curtain, blinding him. When the truck finally stopped, he was in the middle of the road, surrounded by darkness. The engine sputtered, the lights flickered, and everything fell silent. Then the door to his cab opened slowly. He turned, his eyes wide with terror. The man who stepped inside was dressed in a rain-soaked coat, the hood pulled low over his face. But as the man raised his head, Harry's heart froze. It was him. Tommy, Frank, all of them. "You owe," the man whispered, his voice cold, his eyes hollow. "You always have." And then, as the rain beat against the truck, Harry realized what was happening. The storm wasn't just a storm, it was a curse. The road was not just a highway, it was the place where the past came to collect. And now, it was Harry's turn to pay. As the thunder crashed, the truck shuddered, and Harry Daniels finally understood. The rain had come to take him, to bring him face to face with the ghosts he had long tried to forget. And it was too late to outrun them now. Story number 5. The Haunting of Pinesboro. Pinesboro was a town that always seemed to be caught in between time. It sat at the edge of nowhere, where the roads twisted through thick forests, and the only thing that marked it on a map was the faded sign by the main highway. The sign had been there for as long as anyone could remember, chipped and weathered by years of storms. But the real story of Pinesboro wasn't in the sign, it was in the rain. Every year, on the anniversary of the town's founding, a storm would roll in. No matter what the forecast said, no matter how clear the sky had been earlier in the day, the rain would come. Fast, heavy, and unforgiving. It wasn't just rain, either. It was as if the sky itself was mourning something. A flood of sorrow that soaked the earth and the bones of everyone living there. For years, the people of Pinesboro had accepted the storm as a part of their lives. No one really talked about it, not out loud. They had learned to live with it, to go about their business, even as the clouds gathered and the wind began to howl. It was just something that happened, something they couldn't control. And for most of them, that was enough. But for those who had been born and raised in Pinesboro, who knew the stories whispered around the edges of town, there was always a sense of dread that came with that storm. It wasn't just rain, it was the town's curse, the thing that had been haunting them for generations. No one knew when it started. No one could pin down the exact moment it began. But the curse of Pinesboro had been alive as long as the town had existed, and no one had ever dared to question it. On the night of the anniversary, when the rain came, so did the spirits. They would rise from the earth, the restless souls of the past, their faces twisted with anger and pain. They were the ones who had been wronged, the ones who had died in the dark corners of the town's history. They were the forgotten, the ones no one ever talked about, the ones who had been pushed into the shadows. And they didn't come for the dead. No, they came for the living. It was a cold, bitter night when the storm began, just like every other anniversary night. The wind whipped through the trees, and the sky, dark as pitch, opened up, unleashing the rain in torrents. The streets of Pinesboro quickly became rivers, and the people huddled in their homes, trying to ignore the storm, trying to forget what it meant. But they couldn't. In the old part of town, where the houses were leaning and broken down, where the sidewalks were cracked and covered in moss, something was stirring. It started with a low sound, like a whisper on the wind, something barely noticeable. Then, as the night deepened, it grew louder, almost like a chant, a voice rising from the earth itself. And then they began to appear. In the old cemetery near the edge of town, the ground trembled. The graves shifted, and one by one, the dead began to rise. At first, it was subtle, shapes in the dark, shadows moving across the gravestones. But as the storm raged harder, the figures became clearer, their faces emerging from the mist like memories trying to claw their way back to life. They were angry, so angry. They were the town's past, long buried, forgotten, waiting for their chance at revenge. Each spirit had a story, a wrong that had been done to them, a life that had been stolen by the sins of the living. And on this night, when the rain fell the hardest, when the anniversary of the town's founding rolled around, they would make their move. Inside the homes, the people of Pinesboro were trying to ignore the noises outside. They locked their doors, pulled their curtains tight, and told themselves that it was just a storm, just the wind. But they couldn't ignore the things they had heard, the things they had been taught to fear but never truly believed. Not until tonight. The spirits didn't just haunt the cemetery. No, they moved through the town, seeking out the descendants of the ones who had wronged them. The families who still lived in the old houses, in the homes where their ancestors had lived. The ones who had benefited from the sins of the past. James Carter, the town's sheriff, stood at the window of his office, watching the rain pour down in sheets, his breath fogging up the glass. He'd heard the stories as a kid, the ones about the ghosts of Pinesboro, about how the rain was a curse, about how the town had been built on blood. But as an adult, he had learned to dismiss them. they were just stories, after all. Or so he thought. As the storm picked up, James felt a chill crawl up his spine. It wasn't just the weather, it was something else. Something darker. He turned, looking out the window at the empty streets, and then he saw it. A figure, standing in the middle of the road, staring directly at him. The figure was tall, almost skeletal, dressed in ragged clothes from another time. The figure raised its hand, as if beckoning him. His heart pounded in his chest, and his mouth went dry. He knew what it meant. The spirit was calling him. And as he stepped toward the door, the whispers began. Come with us. The ghosts were no longer just figures in the dark. They were here, in the streets, in the homes, in the hearts of everyone who had ever lived in Pinesboro. And they weren't going to stop until they had their revenge. One by one, the people of Pinesboro were pulled from their homes, dragged into the night by the spirits they had tried to forget. They couldn't run. They couldn't hide. The curse of Pinesboro was as old as the town itself, and it wasn't going to let them go. By morning, the storm had passed. The rain had stopped, leaving behind a damp silence. The streets were empty, save for the remnants of what had been a town lost to time, a town lost to its own sins. The people of Pinesboro were gone, and all that remained were the whispers of the past, carried by the wind, waiting for the next storm to roll in. Story number 6. The Eye of the Storm. The storm hit without warning. 1 minute, the sky was just a heavy gray, the kind of color you get before a thunderstorm rolls in. But by the time they'd reached the old cabin in the woods, the clouds had twisted into something darker, something angry, and the wind began to howl like a thing alive. There were 6 of them: Adam, Sarah, Ben, Laura, Jake, and Emma. They had come up here for a weekend getaway, a break from the city, away from work, the noise, the stress. The cabin had been a place of refuge, or so they'd thought. A little isolated retreat nestled in the woods, perfect for hiking, drinking beer by the fire, and telling stories that only seemed funny after a few drinks. But the storm? It wasn't supposed to be this bad. By the time they unloaded their gear and got inside, the sky had cracked open, and the rain was coming down in sheets. Adam had tried to get a fire going, but the wood was damp, and no matter how hard he tried, it wouldn't catch. The windows rattled with the wind, and the creaky old cabin groaned under the weight of the storm. "This isn't just a storm," Sarah muttered, staring out the window, her face pale in the dim light. She'd never been the superstitious type, but something about the storm felt wrong. It's like the whole sky is trying to swallow us whole. Jake chuckled from across the room, his voice full of drunken bravado. "Oh, come on, Sarah. It's just a storm. We're safe here." He waved a hand toward the walls, the worn furniture, and the thick logs that made up the cabin's frame. What could possibly go wrong? But as if on cue, the wind picked up again, louder this time, and the rain slammed against the windows. The shutters rattled in their frames like they were trying to break free. The light flickered. Okay, maybe we're in for a long night," Laura said, half laughing, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. She pulled a blanket from the couch and wrapped it around her shoulders. "How about we all play a game to pass the time?" They settled in the living room, the fire still refusing to start, and they passed around a bottle of whiskey. The storm outside made the cabin feel like it was a world away from anything real. The walls seemed to close in, the sound of the rain like a steady drum, and the low rumble of thunder filled the space between their words. But then, just as they were getting comfortable, the unease started to creep in. Ben was the first to notice it. He had been quiet all evening, nursing his drink in his hand, staring at the fireless hearth. There was something about the way he was looking at the others now, like he was seeing them for the first time, that made the hairs on the back of Adam's neck stand up. "Ben?" Sarah asked, her voice soft, a little unsure. "You okay?" Ben's eyes flicked toward her, and for a split second his gaze didn't seem like Ben's at all. It was colder, darker. But then he blinked, and the moment passed. "Yeah," he said, his voice low, too low. "I'm fine." But the storm outside had taken on a new urgency. The wind howled now, and the rain was no longer a gentle rhythm. It was slashing, pounding against the cabin like something trying to break in. The power flickered, and then the lights went out completely, leaving them all in darkness. Adam cursed under his breath, reaching for the flashlight in his bag, but before he could get it, the air in the room shifted, cold, like ice. A wave of dread washed over him, and the hairs on his arms stood up. Ben was standing now, a dark silhouette in the flickering light from the window. His face, what little of it they could see, was twisted into something unfamiliar. "Ben?" Adam's voice came out sharp. "What's going on?" Ben didn't answer. Instead, he moved slowly toward the door, his footsteps too quiet, like he wasn't even walking on the floorboards anymore. The others stayed frozen in their seats, watching as Ben's figure got closer to the door, his hand slowly turning the handle. "No!" Sarah shouted suddenly, her voice cracking. "Don't open the door!" But it was too late. The door flew open with a violent gust of wind, the rain immediately flooding into the room. Ben stepped outside, his silhouette merging with the storm, disappearing into the night. "Ben!" Adam called, rushing after him, but the storm swallowed his voice whole. He barely made it past the threshold before he was pulled back inside by Sarah. "No," she whispered, her eyes wide. "This isn't right. This isn't Ben." "What the hell are you talking about?" Jake asked, his voice still thick with alcohol, but even he sounded shaken now. He's just drunk, right?" "No," Sarah whispered again. "Ben has been hiding something for a long time, and whatever it is, it's not just him anymore." Adam felt the blood drain from his face. He turned to look at Laura, who was trembling in the corner, her eyes wide with fear. "Why didn't you tell us, Laura?" Adam demanded. His voice felt strange, like it wasn't his own. Laura's lip trembled, and she slowly nodded toward the window. It was there, in the flashes of lightning, there, in the trees. Ben's face, but it wasn't really Ben. It was a twisted, contorted version of him, staring back at them, his mouth twisted into a grin that wasn't human. His eyes, those eyes were dark, empty. "No," Laura whispered. "Ben did something. He didn't tell you all, and now it's too late." The wind outside screamed again, the rain harder than ever, and as the storm raged against the walls of the cabin, the door creaked open once more. Ben, or whatever had become of him, was back. And this time, it was different. This time, there was no hiding. The curse of the storm had taken hold, and so had the secret Ben had been hiding. Story number 7. The Last Drop. Eastbrook had always been a quiet town, the kind of place where nothing ever really happened, the kind of place where the days stretched long and the nights seemed to drag on forever. It was the kind of place where you'd never expect something terrible to happen, but that was before the fire. The fire came on a night like any other, with a sky as clear as glass and the moon hanging low over the horizon. It started in the old textile mill on the edge of town, where the machinery hummed like a heartbeat, unaware that it was about to be silenced forever. By the time the fire department showed up, it was too late. The flames were already eating through the building, devouring everything in their path. Dozens of people died that night. Families, children, workers who had lived in Eastbrook their entire lives. gone, just like that. No one ever really talked about it, not openly. But every year, on the anniversary of that night, the rain would come. It wasn't just any rain. It would start with a single drop, just one, falling from the sky at exactly midnight, and then it would pour, as if the heavens themselves were weeping. People in Eastbrook had learned to expect it. They knew what it meant. They said that anyone who survived the night of the fire would be cursed, marked by the rain, doomed to carry the weight of that tragedy forever. And there was one survivor, Ella Matthews. She was just a child when the fire broke out. Her parents had died in the flames, and she had been pulled from the wreckage, burned and broken, but alive. She had been taken in by her aunt, raised in the house on Oak Street, but the memories of that night never left her. The sound of the fire trucks, the scream of sirens, the smell of smoke thick in the air. It haunted her dreams for years. But Ella had grown up, moved away from Eastbrook, and lived her life. She became a nurse, married, had children, and built a life for herself far from the town that had left her with so many scars. But every year, without fail, she would remember the rain. This year, though, something had changed. Ella had come back to Eastbrook, driven by a feeling she couldn't shake. The anniversary of the fire was fast approaching, and she couldn't ignore the pull to return to the place that had both saved her and scarred her. She stood on the porch of her aunt's old house, now empty and overgrown with ivy. The house looked different, but the memories were still there, tucked away in the corners, in the walls, in the creaky floors. She could almost hear her aunt's voice calling to her, as if the house itself was alive with the past. The rain hadn't started yet, but Ella could feel it coming, like a storm pressing against her chest. As she walked through the streets of Eastbrook, she saw the same old faces. People who hadn't changed, people who still wore the past like a second skin. They looked at her with a mix of pity and fear, their eyes avoiding hers, as if they were afraid she would remind them of what they had lost. Ella no habloken nady. She just walked. She needed answers. Her feet took her to the site of the old textile mill. Now, all that remained was a vacant lot, the charred remnants of what had once been the heart of the town. It was eerily quiet. The rain hadn't started yet, but the air was thick with the weight of it. Ella stood there, looking at the empty space where so many had died. She could almost hear the screams, the crackle of the flames, the suffocating heat. Suddenly, the wind picked up. A single drop of rain splashed onto her face, followed by another, then another. And then, just like every year before, the rain began to fall in earnest. But it wasn't just rain. It was as if the sky had opened up, as if the earth itself was crying. The sound of it was deafening, filling her ears, drowning out everything else, and then she saw it. In the middle of the lot, standing where the mill had burned to the ground, was a figure. A man, tall and thin, his face hidden in the shadows of the rain. He was watching her, unmoving, his presence like a weight pressing down on her chest. Ella's breath caught in her throat. She knew who he was. "Why?" she whispered, her voice breaking through the storm. "Why did you do it?" The figure didn't move. The rain poured down harder now, almost as if it were trying to drown her, to bury her in the past. She stepped forward, her feet sinking into the mud, the rain stinging her skin. She had to know. She had to know the truth. "Why did you start the fire?" she cried out, her voice breaking with emotion. "Why did you kill all those people?" The figure tilted his head, and then slowly he stepped forward. The closer he got, the clearer his face became. His eyes were hollow, dark pits where there should have been light. And as he stepped closer, Ella's heart froze. "You were always meant to survive," he said, his voice low and rasping, like the sound of old paper being torn. You were always meant to be the last one standing. But now, it's time to make things right. Ella's blood ran cold as the man reached out, his hand hovering just above her chest. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. The rain, the wind, even the thunder, it all stopped. And then, with one final breath, the man spoke the last words she would ever hear. "The curse is yours now." The storm raged on, and Ella Matthews fell to the ground, the last drop of rain falling on her face. And for the first time in years, she understood. The curse had always been hers to carry. Story number 8. The Rain Dancer. Eldridge was the kind of small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. The streets were lined with old houses, their paint peeling, their porches sagging under the weight of time. The town had a way of holding on to things, especially its secrets. It had been that way for as long as anyone could remember, and most folks were okay with that. Life in Eldridge moved slowly, like the creek that wound through the town, barely making a ripple, just trudging along. But there was one thing about Eldridge that set it apart from other places: the rain. Or rather, the boy who could make it rain. Ethan Blake had always been different. Ever since he was a little kid, he had a way about him. A strange kind of energy that made the weather listen to him. It started when he was 4 or 5, just a boy with a mop of dark hair and a wide grin, stomping his feet in the backyard and twirling around, his little arms flailing as he spun in circles. The first time it happened, it was just a light drizzle. His parents thought it was coincidence, just a fluke. But then, it happened again, and again. By the time Ethan was 12, everyone in town knew. Whenever the sky was too dry, whenever the crops needed water or the air just felt too heavy, Ethan would go out to the middle of the street, raise his arms, and dance. The town would watch from their windows, amazed, as the clouds would gather above him, dark and thick. And then the rain would fall, soft at first, but then heavier, until it poured down in sheets, quenching the earth. It became something of a ritual. People didn't talk much about it, but everyone knew the boy was special. Some believed it was a gift from God, others thought it was just a strange quirk of nature, something that couldn't be explained. But nobody complained. They'd watch him dance, the water falling all around him, and they'd be grateful. After all, Eldridge didn't get much rain, and the crops were always better when Ethan danced. But on one particular night things changed. It was late summer, and the air was thick with humidity. The sky had been overcast all day, heavy with the promise of rain, but it had never come. The town sat in the stillness, the kind of silence that feels like it's waiting for something to happen. Ethan was standing in his backyard, staring at the sky. It was late, past midnight, but he couldn't sleep. The air was too oppressive, the tension in the atmosphere unbearable. He raised his arms, the familiar rhythm of the dance coming to him like a second nature. He began to sway, his feet moving slowly at first, then faster, the motions becoming more frantic. The clouds above him began to swirl, as they always did when he called for the rain. But this time, something felt different. The air grew heavier, colder, and the wind started to howl. A low, mournful sound that carried through the town like a warning. The sky darkened, but not in the usual way. No, this time the clouds seemed to churn, a swirling vortex of black and gray, and there was something sinister about them. Then, the first drop fell. It wasn't like any rain Ethan had ever seen. The water was thick, almost tar-like, as it splashed onto the ground. It didn't shine in the moonlight like normal rain. No, it seemed to absorb the light, like it didn't want to be seen. Ethan stopped dancing for a moment, his heart racing. He looked up, his breath coming in sharp gasps, and he saw the storm above him, black as night, growing larger, closing in on the town. The rain came harder now, and Ethan could feel something in the air, something wrong. A chill ran down his spine as the drops fell faster and heavier, soaking into the earth. And then the first scream cut through the silence. It came from Mrs. Walters, the elderly woman who lived 2 houses down. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. The scream was followed by another and then another. Panic spread through the town like wildfire, and Ethan could hear doors slamming open, people shouting, crying out in terror. He turned to look at the street, his breath catching in his throat. People were stumbling out of their homes, their eyes wide with fear. But there was something else, something more terrifying. Their faces twisted in rage. They weren't just frightened, they were angry, furious, and they were looking at Ethan. Mrs. Walters was the first to move, her old body jerking unnaturally, her arms raised as if to strike. Her eyes locked on Ethan's, and for a moment he thought he saw something behind them, something dark, something not human. "Ethan!" she screamed, her voice guttural, warped. "You've cursed us all. You've made us see it." Before he could move, Ben Harris, the local butcher, burst from his front door, his face pale, his hands clenched into fists. His eyes were wide with madness. You brought it with your dance," Ben shouted, his voice wild. Ethan tried to back away, but the crowd was moving toward him now, their eyes burning with anger, their movements jerky and unnatural, as if they were puppets on strings. Something was happening to them, something that made their once friendly faces look like twisted masks of rage. The rain, thick and heavy, kept falling, and with each drop they seemed to change, becoming more monstrous, more savage. Panic surged through Ethan's chest. He could feel the weight of it pressing in, the terror, the confusion. Why was this happening? What had he done? The rain wasn't supposed to do this. It was supposed to help. It had always helped. He stumbled back toward the house, his mind racing. He had to stop it. He had to fix this. But how? What had gone wrong? Then, in the distance, he saw something that made his blood freeze. A shadow moved in the darkness, tall and hulking, its outline monstrous. And then it was gone. Ethan's heart hammered in his chest. The curse wasn't just on the people, it was on the whole town, on him. The rain, once his gift, had become his curse. But what was it that had made the rain turn dark? What had changed? The answer was closer than he thought. The curse had always been there, lurking, waiting for the right moment. And now, the storm was just the beginning. The twisted, murderous versions of the townspeople weren't the end. They were only the start. Ethan Blake had called the rain, but now it was calling for him. And unless he could stop the storm, unless he could stop the curse, Eldridge would be lost to the darkness forever. Story number 9. The Sound of the Storm. For as long as Emily could remember, there had been the storm. It wasn't like any other storm, at least not the ones people talked about. The rain would fall, sure, but it wasn't the rain that made her skin crawl. It was the sound. It started when she was a little girl, just a toddler, living with her parents in the old farmhouse on the outskirts of town. At first, she thought it was just the wind howling through the trees, the way it always did when the storm came in. But as she got older, she realized it was something more. The sound wasn't like thunder. It wasn't the crash of lightning or the rumble of a storm rolling in. It was a low, almost melodic hum. A vibrating hum that seemed to come from the air itself, like the sky was alive, watching her. At night, when the storm raged outside, Emily would lie in her bed, curled under her blankets, her eyes wide open as the sound filled the room. She tried to tell her parents, but they never heard it. No one ever did. It was always just her. And no matter how hard she tried to ignore it, it never stopped. The storm always came with the rain, and it always came without warning. One moment, the air would be still, and the next, the clouds would roll in, thick and dark, heavy with the weight of something unspeakable. The sound would follow shortly after, and Emily would hold her breath, waiting for the storm to pass. But no matter how many times it came, she never got used to it. As she grew older, Emily moved away from the farmhouse. She left behind the rolling hills, the sound of the storm, and the dark corners of her childhood home. She moved into a small apartment in the city, and for a while, it seemed like she could escape it. The noise stopped, and the rain didn't feel as heavy, but deep down, she knew it wasn't over. It came back one night without warning. The sound, that low hum, vibrating through the walls, through her very bones. The storm was just outside her window, and as the rain began to fall, she could hear it again. The hum, like a voice calling to her. This time, it wasn't just the sound, it was something else, something more tangible, a presence, a feeling in the air, like something was waiting, watching. Emily tried to shake it off. She tried to ignore the noise, the way it made her pulse race, the way her skin tingled with unease. But the storm kept coming, and the sound, always the sound, kept getting louder. One night, it came at the same time as a new neighbor moved in next door. His name was Daniel. He was a quiet man, around Emily's age, and he'd only recently relocated to the building. He wasn't unfriendly, just distant, like he was carrying some kind of weight, though Emily couldn't figure out what. It was a rainy evening when she first spoke to him. She had gone out to check her mailbox and he happened to be outside, struggling with a box on his doorstep. "Need some help?" she asked, feeling awkward. She wasn't much for small talk, but she figured it was a good way to break the silence between them. He glanced up at her, his face a little drawn, his eyes shadowed, like he hadn't been sleeping well. But when he smiled, it was warm enough. "Sure, if you don't mind," he said, his voice low and a little rough, like he hadn't used it much. "Just getting settled in, been a long day." She helped him with the box, and they ended up talking for a few minutes about the usual neighbor stuff, how long he'd been in town, what he thought of the place, how the building wasn't quite as quiet as he expected. But when they were done, and the box was safely inside his apartment, something shifted in the air. The storm started and Emily could feel it. The rain began to fall, thick and heavy, like it always did. And then, there it was, the sound, the hum, the vibration. It filled the air like it had always done, and she froze, her heart pounding in her chest. Daniel stopped in his tracks, his face going pale. He turned slowly, his eyes narrowing as if he were trying to place something in his memory. "You hear it too?" Emily asked before she could stop herself, her voice trembling with the weight of the question. Daniel didn't answer right away. He just stood there, his gaze distant, as if the sound were taking him somewhere else. Finally, he nodded, a slight frown pulling at the corners of his mouth. "I've been hearing it since I moved in," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The sound, the storm. It's always there, just like you said, and it's been happening every time it rains." I thought I was going crazy. Emily's chest tightened. The realization hit her like a wave. The storm, the sound. It wasn't just her, it wasn't a curse, it wasn't some strange gift she'd been born with. No, it was something else. It was a signal. And then the answer clicked into place. The storm wasn't just the storm, it was something far worse. Daniel's face turned even paler, and his voice was hoarse when he spoke next. "It's been happening for years, hasn't it? You and me, we're not the only ones." The hairs on the back of Emily's neck stood up as she stared at him. realizing just how much she had been avoiding, how much she had been afraid to know. The sound wasn't a curse. It was the signal that something, someone, was coming. Something that had been waiting for years. As the rain grew heavier, the hum grew louder, vibrating the walls of the building. Emily felt a chill run down her spine, a deep, primal fear she couldn't explain. The storm wasn't just weather. It was a warning. And whatever it was closing in. "You're not crazy," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "But we might be the only ones who can stop it." She didn't know how. She didn't know what to do. But she knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just the rain, it was something else. And it was coming for them all. Story number 10. The Rainmaker's Curse. There was always something unsettling about the old house on Willow Creek Road. It sat at the edge of town, the kind of place that seemed forgotten by time, with ivy creeping up the sides and the windows so covered in dust you couldn't see inside. The townspeople spoke of it in whispers, just as they spoke of the legend of the Rainmaker, a man who had once lived in that house and could control the rain. But every time it rained, something bad happened, something terrible. The legend was never told openly. It was passed down in hushed tones, told to children as warnings and to the elderly as a way of reminding them of the past they hoped had been left behind. The Rainmaker, they said, had been a reclusive man, strange and distant, who'd lived alone in the house. He was said to have the power to summon rain whenever he wanted, to make the crops grow, to stop droughts, to save the town when the land had been dry for too long. But with every storm, with every rainfall he called, something dark followed. The people didn't know why, and they didn't question it. They just knew that when the rain came, it meant trouble. The old house had been abandoned for years after the Rainmaker died. No one ever took it. The people of the town had learned to live without it. They had forgotten the stormy nights, the strange occurrences, the horrors that followed the sound of the rain. That is, until the Johnson family moved in. Rick and Carol Johnson weren't from around here. They were city folks, looking for a quiet life away from the noise and the bustle. Carol had fallen in love with the house the moment she saw it. It was big and old, with a history she could never fully understand, but something about it called to her. Rick, always the practical one, had reservations, but they needed a fresh start, and the price was right. The house creaked with age, but the walls felt sturdy, the rooms spacious. It was everything Carol had dreamed of. But it was only when they unpacked the last of the boxes and set foot in the backyard that they realized something was off. The rain came the very next night. At first, it was a light drizzle, the kind of rain that felt almost comforting, the soft tap-tap against the windows like a lullaby. Carol didn't think much of it, though Rick felt a shiver run through him when he heard the first rumbles of thunder in the distance. By the morning, the rain was heavier, turning the ground outside into a slick, mud-filled mess. The storm didn't stop. It didn't even seem like it would. It felt endless, like it was settling in for a long stay. Carol noticed something strange that afternoon. The rain kept coming, but it didn't seem to be affecting the rest of the town. The roads were dry. The sky was clear. The storm, it seemed, was centered only on their house. By nightfall, the wind picked up, howling through the trees, and the house groaned, settling deeper into the earth. Then came the sound. A low hum. At first, it was just in the distance, like an animal in the woods. But it grew louder, clearer, until it seemed to come from the very walls of the house. Rick was pacing by the window, trying to see if anyone else had noticed the storm. He could see the trees bending under the wind, the water rising in the yard. He turned to Carol, his face pale, his voice shaking. "This isn't right," he muttered. This isn't normal." Carol didn't speak. She was staring at the dark sky, feeling it press down on her, making it hard to breathe. The sound, that hum, felt like it was inside her head now. It was like a pulse, a heartbeat that didn't belong. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. Rick's heart leapt in his chest. Who could be out there in this storm? He opened the door to find a woman standing in the rain, her hair drenched, her clothes soaked through. She looked wild, her eyes wide with fear, and she didn't speak when he opened the door. Instead, she pushed past him into the house, as though she knew exactly where she was going. Carol stepped back, unsure of what to do. Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling. The woman's eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, Carol saw something in them that made her blood run cold. "The Rainmaker," the woman whispered, her voice hoarse, as if it had been a long time since she'd spoken. "You've awakened." Rick slammed the door shut, heart racing. "What do you mean? Who are you? How do you know about him?" The woman didn't answer right away. She moved into the living room, her eyes scanning the space as though she were looking for something, searching for a sign. "The rain," she said, almost to herself. "It always starts with the rain, and it ends with death." Carol felt a chill creep down her spine. "What are you talking about, death?" The woman turned to face her, her expression hardening. "The house," she said. "The house and the man who lived here. He made a deal with something terrible. And now, his curse is yours. Every storm that comes, it will take something from you." The rain outside began to pound against the house harder, as if it were in a frenzy. Rick felt the wall shudder, and a strange noise echoed from somewhere deep within the house. An awful creaking, like something was breaking, splintering under the weight of the storm. "Why is it happening to us?" Rick demanded, stepping closer. "We just moved in. We don't deserve this." The woman didn't flinch. "It doesn't care who deserves it. The curse doesn't choose. It just comes." And then, as if to prove her words true, the lights flickered once, then went out. The house was plunged into darkness. The only sound the roar of the storm outside and that low, pulsing hum. Something terrible was coming. Rick and Carol stood frozen, the weight of the curse settling on them like a shadow. The woman was right. The storm wasn't just a storm, it was the beginning. And unless they found a way to break the curse, their lives, everything they thought they knew, would be torn apart by the rain.